If you've ever called yourself lazy because you procrastinate, I want to challenge that. After over 8,000 hours of coaching people with big goals who struggle with procrastination, I found something surprising. And that's that I've never met a truly lazy procrastinator. What I've found instead are people who are unconsciously protecting themselves by procrastinating. And the moment you stop treating your procrastination like a willpower problem and start understanding what it's protecting you from, everything changes. And in this video, I'll show you the real reason you procrastinate and why fighting yourself harder to develop more willpower is often the very thing keeping you stuck. Now, over the past 7.5 years, I've worked with hundreds of clients who've been struggling with procrastination and self-sabotage and other issues like that hold them back from their full potential. And I've had many clients tell me that before seeking out my services, they were trying to overcome their procrastination and self-sabotage issues with willpower and just trying to be more disciplined. And maybe some of them try to develop better routines or habits, but none of that worked. And every single time, upon deeper exploration, there were always deeper underlying dynamics that were causing that surface level procrastination issue. And so if you try to overcome procrastination and self-sabotage by using willpower, what you're doing is you're just fighting with symptoms. Now, to give a metaphor of what it's like to try to use willpower to overcome procrastination, I want you to imagine that you're the captain of a boat. And what's happening is that as you're trying to move the boat forward, what's happening is that it's not moving forward very fast, or it's maybe hung up in some way, or maybe it's not moving forward at all. And so this is the part of the analogy that tracks on with procrastination or stalling out or self-sabotage. Now, if you're somebody who would see procrastination as a willpower issue and as just a need to stop being lazy and just needing to put your nose to the grindstone, then in this metaphor, the way that tracks on is to be the sea captain that's trying to move the boat forward by just putting as much power into it as possible and trying to hit the gas pedal as hard as possible. But if you realize that procrastination isn't a willpower issue and it isn't a laziness issue, that's when you can start getting curious about what's actually holding the boat back. And you find that the boat is actually dragging like 1 or 2 anchors behind it. And then once you realize that the problem with the boat is that it's dragging anchors, you can figure out how to pull those anchors up. Then you can just drive the boat forward as normal without using excessive amounts of force. And the same thing is true with procrastination issues. Once you realize what the underlying root cause is of your procrastination, you can actually pull those anchors up so that you can just work as normal without having to be excessively disciplined and without having to use tons of willpower. Now, the challenge here when it comes to pulling your anchors up and to be able to overcome procrastination that way is that we're often unconscious to what our anchors really are. We often don't realize what the underlying root cause is to our procrastination. And so when I work with clients, what I help them do is I help them ladder down to the actual root cause and think about it almost like peeling off layers of an onion until you get to the center. Or you can even think of it like unearthing a root vegetable. Like imagine that you were going to go out picking carrots and the leaves of the carrot and the root of the carrot look very different. So the root of the carrot is orange. It's what you typically associate with carrots, whereas the leaves are green and they have a very particular type of look about them. And so if you're going to go picking carrots, you're not going to be looking around for the orange roots. Those are buried underneath the ground. You're unconscious to them. Instead, you're going to get really, really good at noticing carrot leaves. And in this case, because we're talking about procrastination is an example of the leaves. That's the top lying thing that you're aware of, that you're conscious of, that if you actually start asking questions about it, you can start to unearth the actual root cause underneath it, and you can reveal the orange carrot. And this process of finding the leaves and using them to pull up the root is often called shadow work. And so the first step here is to notice the leaves. In this case, it's procrastination. And then you can start asking yourself questions like, how is this procrastination meant to protect me? Or how is this procrastination meant to serve me? And then from there, you can ask other follow-up questions. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's say that I'm a procrastinator and I notice myself procrastinating. So now I've noticed the carrot leaves. And so then I ask myself, how am I trying to protect or serve myself by procrastinating? And maybe I find out that maybe there's some kind of overwhelm that's associated with doing that particular task that I am procrastinating on. And then I can ask myself deeper questions about that. So it's, why is that overwhelming to me? And maybe I find that it's overwhelming to me because I already feel like I'm taking on too much responsibility. And then I can ask myself, well, why am I taking on too much responsibility? And then maybe I find out that I have a general tendency to internalize responsibility over things outside of the scope of my own control. And I go, that's interesting. Why do I have a tendency to take on responsibility for things outside of the scope of my control? And then maybe I find that as a kid, I had to internalize responsibility over everybody's feelings and try to keep everybody happy. And then I asked myself, it's like, okay, well, why did I need to keep everybody happy when I was a kid? It's like, okay, well, when people were unhappy, that's when chaos happened. And I asked myself, okay, well, what was so bad about the chaos that happened? It's like, okay, well, I would feel unsafe. And so now by locating the leaves and using them to pull up the root, I now understand a lot more about my procrastination tendencies deeper down. So instead of thinking of it as a laziness issue, now I recognize that, oh, there's this whole pattern that I have to compensate for feelings of unsafety where I internalize responsibility for everything. And so now I'm procrastinating because that coping strategy is making me feel overwhelmed. I'm already internalizing too much responsibility, and so when I try to work on my work, it's just an overwhelm. And so there would be two layers there. So one is helping me feel safe enough in order to not have to internalize all of that responsibility. And once I stop internalizing all of that responsibility, just my daily tasks will become a lot less overwhelming because I'm not putting too much on my plate that's outside of my control. And that's just one example of how this process can go, but you can recognize that the leaves are very different than the roots. The symptoms are very different than the root cause in this, because procrastination and the overwhelm because of unsafety and the tendency to internalize responsibility over things outside of the scope of your control, those things look very different from one another. And in society, we tend to associate procrastination with laziness, but in this case, there's such a deeper pattern going on that has nothing to do with laziness at all. And everyone's reasons for procrastination are slightly different, but there are some common patterns that I've noticed across my 7.5 years working as a coach, and I call it the 1,000 human patterns. And so there's a finite number of patterns that people go through. Even though there are many of them, there are things that you can start to understand why it is that people procrastinate and why it is that people self-sabotage and why it is that people stand in their own way. But with those 1,000 human patterns that exist, I've organized them into 5 main categories of reasons why people procrastinate and self-sabotage. Now, those 5 underlying root cause reasons for procrastination are that your goal is out of alignment from what it is that you really want to do. The second one is that limiting beliefs are holding you back. The third one is that you're trying to avoid uncomfortable, unpleasant emotions. The fourth one is that there is a trust issue going on within yourself and outside of yourself. Or number 5, there are unmet needs that are happening. Either you're getting your needs met in the status quo and wouldn't if you reached your goal, or you're not getting your needs met in the status quo at all, and so part of you is rebelling from your goals. And with the example that I had just given about internalizing responsibility for things outside of the scope of your control and then procrastinating in order to avoid the overwhelm of doing another task, there are 2 of these happening at once. So one is that there is a lack of trust there. So whenever we start internalizing responsibility for things outside of the scope of our control, we're not trusting the external world with power and responsibility. And so really at the root of this one is a trust issue. But then in that tendency to not trust, we then monopolize all of this power and responsibility, and we put so much on our plate, and we try to gain traction over things that are not within the scope of our control, and that feels overwhelming. And so when we're actually doing the procrastinating, we're trying to avoid an uncomfortable, unpleasant feeling, which is overwhelm. And so at the root, it's a problem with trust, and at the surface, it's more of a problem with overwhelm. And so that gives you an example of how all of those 5 reasons can go together. And your reason for procrastinating could have to do with 1, 2, 3, 4, or all 5 of those reasons I just mentioned. And what I'm going to do for each of these 5 underlying root causes of procrastination is I'm going to give you some common client examples that I've seen over the past 7 years. But before I do that, I wanted to mention that if this is resonating with you and you want to learn more about how to overcome self-sabotage and procrastination, I highly recommend checking out my free webinar called 3 Shadow Work Secrets to Get Out of Your Own Way and Reach Your Full Potential Without Having to Fight Yourself, and the link is down below in the description box. I also have a link to an application if you would like to work with me. All right, so here are some common examples of root causes of procrastination that I've seen over my time as a coach, and each of these fall into one of the 5 categories that I just mentioned earlier in the video. Now, as I mentioned before, the first underlying root cause reason for procrastination is because our goal is out of alignment with what it is that we really want. And so we procrastinate because we know that we're swimming up the wrong stream, we're going the wrong way. And so a common client example that I've seen, usually with people who are trying to change careers, is that they will have made a decision about their career from a state of negative motivation. And what they'll do is they'll go like, okay, what do I need in order to make money? And so I can avoid all of this stress and I can pay the bills. And so they're making decisions from survival mode. And when we make major life decisions from negative motivation, we say, okay, hang on a second, I just need a job that pays the bills, or hey, I just need a relationship so I don't feel lonely, or I just need to be here because temporarily this helps me avoid some negative situation. What happens is that part of ourselves feels the misalignment. Part of us knows that it's not really what we want. And so the top level symptoms that come up are things like procrastination, self-sabotage, and tons of resistance and friction. And out of all of these 5 categories, this one is the most difficult one to deal with because it causes us to actually have to tweak or change our life trajectory. We have to change maybe the job that we're in, or we have to change the way that we approach the job that we're in at the very least. Or maybe we have to leave behind certain relationships so that we can line up with other relationships. Or maybe we need to move forward and change our lifestyle altogether. So this one requires potentially quite a lot of change. Now, the second underlying root cause reason for procrastination is if we have some kind of limiting belief. And a really common limiting belief that I've seen my clients either consciously or unconsciously hold is the idea that there is a hierarchy and that they're inferior in some way in that hierarchy. And so an example of how this could lead to procrastination is that maybe they don't put in the work to actually be able to build the business that they want because they perceive themselves as lower in the hierarchy than other more serious people who have more license to be starting a business. So it's to perceive other people here and themselves down here. And so it's like, okay, maybe I shouldn't go for that promotion because I'm down here. And it can be very challenging because we can be using this perception of some kind of existential hierarchy to try to cope with things and to try to make ourselves feel safer by getting certainty about our standing. But oftentimes it makes us feel either down here or feeling like we need to go up here in some way to compensate for that perceived inferiority. And in settings where there's a practical hierarchy, like in a corporation, oftentimes this perception of just being inherently lower in the hierarchy, that can actually prevent somebody from taking the steps to move up in their job and to actually advance and get promoted. Now, the third category of underlying root causes for procrastination are that we're procrastinating in order to avoid some kind of uncomfortable or unpleasant feeling. Sometimes it can be the feelings that directly come up when you start to work. Maybe there are feelings of overwhelm or feelings of exhaustion that can come up that actually are difficult to face into if you're to work on your work. But another dynamic in quite a lot of my clients is that there's a tendency to procrastinate on things that might lead to success because success might lead to greater exposure and scrutiny. And so in that case, the procrastination is there to avoid shame and feelings of exposure. And so to overcome this, it's very important to actually be willing to face with feelings like overwhelm and shame and overexposure. Being able to face into the most difficult feelings from a regulated nervous system state is actually what enables us to feel more comfortable and safe moving forward with our goals if those difficult emotions happen to crop up at some point in the pursuit or achievement of those goals. Now, the fourth underlying root cause reason for procrastination is that there's a trust issue. So we either don't trust ourselves, we don't trust the external world, and basically it's usually some combination of those two things. And one way that I've seen this come up with clients before is that they're trying to achieve their goals, but they're going over their own boundaries while they're trying to achieve those goals. And so what that does when somebody goes over their own boundaries, what's going to happen is part of them is not going to trust them to actually move in that direction in a way that honors those boundaries. And so we can end up with a lot of self-sabotage and a lot of procrastination that way. And this has come up in a lot of different forms over the years, but I'm just going to give one particular example. So I had one of my clients who wanted to create this blog, and this client had a really, really strong value of transparency and wanted to share so many different elements of their life. And what would happen is whenever they would go to write, they would end up procrastinating, they would end up self-sabotaging, they'd end up holding themselves back. And upon deeper reflection and asking those laddering questions, what we discovered is that there was a need for privacy there that wasn't being honored because this client happened to have a really strong value of transparency. So they were ending up going over their own boundaries because they were following that value and didn't even realize that they had these privacy needs because of the very strong values of transparency. And this pattern is actually something that impacted me as well. And you might have heard me talk about this in other videos on this channel where I was holding myself back with my previous YouTube channel, The Diamond Net. And I was like trying to share more of myself because I really wanted to have an outlet to do that. But part of me would always hold back and would end up just avoiding posting on the channel. And so a big part of this is being able to see through our values down to our actual boundaries and to be able to honor those boundaries so that we trust ourselves to move forward with our goals. Otherwise, it's going to cause a lot of procrastination and a lot of self-sabotage. Now, the fifth and final category of root causes why people hold themselves back from their goals and why they procrastinate is because there is some kind of unmet need. Usually the need is being met in the status quo, but if they were to be successful with what it is that they work on, what would happen is that need would get sacrificed. So to give a client example, I was once working with a woman who was doing a side business, but she also had a 9-to-5. And in her 9-to-5, she had lots of different coworkers that she was working with. In her side business, she was a solopreneur, so she was only working with herself. And she was the type of person who really identified as a loner and didn't really feel very comfortable connecting with other people. And whenever she would go to grow her side business, she would find herself self-sabotaging and procrastinating. And what we found upon deeper exploration is that she was actually trying to maintain the current status quo because she was actually meeting her connection needs in the job that she didn't like staying in. Whereas her solopreneur thing, which she actually really enjoyed, she wasn't going to be meeting those connection needs. And because she didn't consciously value connection, she wasn't even aware that she was going to be missing something in that transition into working full-time at her side hustle. So if you end up procrastinating for this reason, it's really important for you to become conscious of what your needs are and then actually meet those needs and incorporate those into your action plan towards your goals that you're trying to work on. That way it makes the procrastination obsolete and you don't actually have to procrastinate anymore. So you can see from all of these 5 underlying root causes of procrastination that none of them have to do with laziness. And that's why willpower is a really ineffective tool to use to overcome self-sabotage. And if you want to learn more about why willpower causes you to procrastinate and self-sabotage, I highly recommend checking out this video right here.